So welcome to Washington Hebrew Congregation's Amram Lecture Series. I'm Rabbi Susan Shankman. I look forward to this morning's presentation, which we bring to you in partnership with the Jewish Book Council. Our guest this morning is Meriel Schindler, who spent the first 15 years of her life growing up in central London before suddenly being moved to a convent school in provincial Austria. 5 years later, she moved back to the UK to study French and German at university, and she's now an employment lawyer, partner, and head of a team at Withers LLP, a law firm. Meriel is also a trustee of the writing charity Arvan. Meriel is married to husband Jeremy, who I believe is on here, and has 3 grown-up children, Sefa, Georgia, and Zach. And The Lost Café Schindler is Meriel's first book. As we know, every Holocaust story is unique and important to be shared and told in order that we can become the keepers of the names and the memories of all those who live these stories. So we are delighted that Meriel Schindler is with us today to share her family story and the journey of discovery that provided this captivating book. And we are also delighted that today she joins us from the Cheltenham Literary Festival. And we thank her for taking time from that to be with us. I believe it's probably almost tea time, if not tea time there. So thank you, Meriel. And we're delighted to have you. I've so enjoyed our conversations leading up to today. And I know whether people have read the book or not, this is your first book. You certainly have a busy career. Why write this book? Why this book and this story?
Thank you so much, Sue, and obviously Beth for doing the technical background bits. Thank you also for the Jewish Book Council for putting us in touch with the Washington Hebrew congregation. I am truly honoured to be zoomed into your sitting rooms this morning at 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning. I do hope you are sitting there with cups of coffee or tea or something nice that would have been appropriate for the cafe, because this is a story about a cafe. And the cafe is essentially one of the main characters in the book. Sue's asked me, why did I write the book? Well, I think, Sue, you've hit the nail exactly on the head, which is to make you guys keepers of these memories, because I do believe that it is important that we transmit some of these stories further into the future. And why did I start writing it? Well, the truth is I had a terrible relationship with my father. It was a fractious, difficult, volatile relationship. And he told an awful lot of anecdotes and stories as we were growing up. He was a bit of a fantasist, and he would say things like, we're related to Franz Kafka. He claimed we were related to Bruno Kreisky, one-time president of Austria. Alma Mahler was another one on his list of relatives, and of course Oskar Schindler. Now, I grew up to be an inquisitive young adult, and I would say things like, how are we related? And of course there was never an answer. He also claimed that he witnessed his father being beaten up on Kristallnacht, the night of the 9th to the 10th of October, November, which is coming up very shortly. I imagine you guys will be commemorating that. And he was beaten up, my grandfather was beaten up on that night by Nazi thugs. And my father claimed he witnessed his father being beaten up with his own childhood toboggan. That was one of the many stories he told us. So we had a difficult relationship, and also we had a very turbulent childhood. The one thing my father did not do is provide us with a stable family life. We, on the one hand, lived in fancy houses, drove fancy cars, and on the other, from one moment to the next, we would have creditors chasing us, bailiffs presenting themselves on our doorstep, and the house being repossessed. So, and then we would flee from one country to another. And that explains why I had this mixed childhood of spending some time in England and then being literally kidnapped and taken to Austria and stuck in a convent school. So that was my very turbulent background. I started out writing the book really as a way of trying to disentangle all the anecdotes I had in my head. So in 2017, my father died, and I had all these stories ghosting around my head, and I wanted to try and understand what had happened, and exactly what, why, and when. And I'm a lawyer by training, so I was keen on the truth. And it started out as a bit of a private history. My father died destitute. I inherited, the only thing I did inherit was 13 extraordinary photo albums with family pictures in them that went right back to pre-First World War Austria, so when it was still the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And I was very curious about these pictures because, like a lot of family photo albums, they didn't have any names under the photos. And I wanted to know who the people were in the pictures and what had happened to them. So that's the why, sort of complex, mixed motivation about finding out the truth. One anecdote I can share with you is that the original strapline for the book, the current strapline is one family, one Jewish family, two wars and the search for truth. However, my strapline was one family, two world wars and many cakes. And you'll understand from the cafe backdrop why I was keen on that. Unfortunately, that didn't make its way through my editors. They wanted something more serious. Anyway, so that's the why in a sense, Sue. You're on mute.
Yes, thank you. And so that's some wonderful motivation to get started. Tell us what the book is about.
So, as I've intimated, it's a book about my Jewish family, essentially through 150 years of history. Now, this isn't, many of you will be very familiar with the families who came from Vienna, the Viennese story, which is a very different story to the one I'm telling. So I'm telling the untold story of the Jews of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Jews of Western Austria, who were certainly the Jews in the Tyrol were highly assimilated. There were very, very few of them, and they lived amongst their neighbours entirely peacefully. This is very different to the sorts of tensions that there were in Vienna, which has been written about a lot, where there were a lot of very, very poor Jews who'd come from the eastern parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, who flooded into Vienna and caused enormous crises in housing and jobs, and there was a lot of tension in Vienna, which fueled some of the anti-Semitism in Vienna. The story in Western Austria is very different. We're dealing with a highly educated, very assimilated merchant class. So my relations, my family from Austria were distillers, and they were assimilated and lived happily amongst their neighbours to a great extent. So that's what the story is about, is that it's taking them through that history.
Also, it's clearly about the cafe as well. I mean, there's certain, all of the family members with whom you connected and who are in the pictures, but looming large in many of those pictures was also the cafe. So tell us a little bit about that, and from distilling to pastry and that journey as well.
Yeah. So the cafe. So my great grandparents were distillers. My great grandmother came from Bohemia, from southern what is now the Czech Republic, and married my great grandfather, and they moved to Innsbruck. And they set up a distillery there, and my great-grandmother's family were distillers, and my great-grandfather learned his trade essentially from my great-grandmother, which I rather like as a feminist because it feels that she taught him something. And they set up a fantastic distillery. They were and a jam factory. And when my grandfather was an adult, he went and fought in the First World War. A brutal First World War, like many of those war experiences, but again one that is a much less told story, even I think in the United States. So I think the US story, you know about the mud of Flanders, you know about the Normandy landings and that landscape. What I think, apart from Hemingway, what is less well known in the US is the southern front. So that was the front that was between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Italians. And my grandfather fought on that front and survived and returned to Innsbruck, and in a sense as an anecdote, as an antidote to the horrors of the First World War, and at a time when Austria was essentially starving, founded this extraordinary cafe. The cafe was founded in a triple-fronted building on the main street in Innsbruck. So it was really prominent and went over 3 or 4 floors, and there was dancing there was live music, incredible coffee, and amazing cakes. They won prizes for their cakes. So this was my grandfather, who was, his mission statement, if you did mission statements in the 1920s, was serve great coffee and cake. That's what he was about, in a fantastic environment. So that's how the cafe came about.
Before we go on and move on from that, would you be willing to share a reading from the book about the cake, just to give us the flavor of what it must have been like? A little taste.
So this is a small extract from page 127 of my edition. Now, as Sue will come on to talk about this, I have the English edition, which looks slightly different to yours, but has the same contents. So
that's a whole conversation in itself about the cover and the colors and the pictures.
We'll come on to that in a little bit. So, Innsbruck 2018. Even today, I have conversations with misty-eyed Innsbruckers who remember tales told by their parents or grandparents of courtship and dancing at the Café Schindler. Frequently, I return to a cloth-covered album I have, which is devoted to photographs of the cafe. I've looked at it so often that I feel I can quite easily insert myself into that time and place. First, I wander down from the Marie-Theresienstrasse into the retail shop on the ground floor, where they sell handmade chocolates and candied fruit in hinged wooden boxes branded with the S. Schindler name. I go up the broad, polished wooden staircase in the corner which leads up to the first floor. That's where the cafe is. Perhaps Hugo Schindler, that's my grandfather himself, is there to greet customers. A proud and congenial patron. A tail-coated waiter takes my coat and ushers me to a banquette at right angles to the window. I have a view of the street below me, the Anna Säule statue, and above all the mountains, which rise up, dredged in snow, to the right of my field of vision. I order coffee and contemplate the cakes that sit behind a curved glass vitrine. Apfelstrudel, apple strudel. Topfenstrudel, cream cheese strudel. Mohnkuchen, poppy seed cake. Linsertorte, hazelnut and red currant jam cake. Topfentorte, baked cheesecake. And Gugelhupf. This last is a plain or chocolate marbled sponge cake with distinctive ridges and a hole in the middle. And of course the Sachertorte, an unauthorized version, far away from the capital. Santol, the head patissier, knows he can serve it, as long as he doesn't call it the original Sachertorte. The coffee arrives served on a metal tray. It's placed discreetly on the starched linen tablecloth in front of me, accompanied by a glass of water to counteract its dehydrating effect. Sugar cubes are piled into small bowls to be extracted with small tongs. Tiny, handleless white jugs hold the cream. Slices of cake are lifted gently with a triangular cake slice and placed on a plate with care. The stakes are high. If they topple over, it is, according to Austrian folklore, certain that an evil mother-in-law awaits me. Assuming the customer has escaped this fate, the cake is decorated with whipped, slightly sweetened cream, or schlag. But I've chosen not a high-rise cake, but the cafe's signature dish, Apfelstrudel, with its exquisitely thin layers of crisp pastry holding in their middle slices of apple, nuts, breadcrumbs, and cinnamon. The acidity of the apples is offset by the buttery pastry, lightly dusted with icing sugar. I take in my surroundings. The cafe hums with conversation. The atmosphere is relaxed and understated. As a guest on my own, I'm free to while away several hours over a single cup of coffee. If I wish, perhaps reading the newspapers, which are stretched each day onto special wooden batons and hung up near the door. No one dreams of trying to hurry me on. If it's the afternoon, the pianist in the corner plays Mozart, Schubert and Chopin. But by the evening, it's time for a change of atmosphere and pace, once the quieter, more conservative daytime guests have departed. A band upstairs on the second floor plays modern, more daring music. Jazz has already made its debut in the Tyrol in 1922 at the Hotel Sonne. The Café Schindler is quick to pick up on the latest trends. And on the 10th of March 1923, Hugo Schindler announces the opening of his dance cafe. This is so successful that by January 1925, the Innsbrucker Nachrichten announces that music is on the menu every day until 2 a.m. Young couples hold hands over the tables and whirl on the dance floors, and later of the second and later the third stories of the building. Tango, foxtrot, swing, and American big band music stream from the open windows on summer evenings. Soon Innsbruck's younger women start appearing at the cafe in daring knee-length dresses with bobbed hair. Sometimes they dance with each other, perhaps highlighting the post-war deficit of young men. Occasionally there's also an all-female orchestra. It's not New York, or Washington, or Paris. It's not even Vienna. But from the detritus of war, the Café Schindler is creating for Tyroleans, in miniature, their very own jazz age.
Thank you. And just hearing you even talk about the various cakes that would be served, one of the delightful surprises at the end of the book, not to give this away, it's not about the story, but there are recipes to all the different delicious cakes that Meriel mentioned. So I encourage you again, I know the link is in the chat. And also just for those of you who are interested, we have book plates that are on their way to us that are signed. So even though we are virtual, you are still able to have a signed copy of Meriel's book. So Meriel, I know you talked about this. There were questions that you had after your father had died, and questions that could not be answered easily because you didn't have the people to ask, and within his papers, etc., there certainly was some information. But you again went on this journey of discovery, and as a lawyer, I'm sure that affected in some ways how you researched and wrote this book. Could you share with us that process of researching all of the information that fills these pages?
So I think as a lawyer, I was very interested in truth finding and nailing facts. And I think it's both a blessing and a curse in many ways. And I think that I had the photo album, so I wanted to go to the places in the photos. So very much the last 3 years have been spent traveling to those places, walking the streets, and sitting in cafes and listening to what was going on around me. So there was a sense of journey in place. And I inherited from my father, aside from the photo albums, heaps and heaps of paper. Now, when he died, we went to sort of look at the cottage he'd been living in on his own in his last years. And it's no exaggeration to say there was a terrible mess. I mean, there were papers everywhere on every surface. The double garage was full of collapsing cardboard boxes full of paper. So we spent, my husband and I and my sister and her husband spent a sort of frantic couple of days trying to sift through the papers to try and work out what we should keep and what we shouldn't. And at that point, I didn't know I was writing a book. So we kept what we thought was relevant, and then we left because the cottage was going to be repossessed by the bank and sold. So that's how we ended up with a lot of paperwork. Now, some of these papers were really hard to look at. They were festooned with swastikas, they were letters that ended Heil Hitler, and they were lists of assets. And one of the things my father had spent his life doing, and it may be sort of the epigenetic side of this, he'd spent a lot of time with lawyers trying to win back every single asset that had been taken from this family. And it was something that became an obsession. Whilst those early restitution cases did result in most of the assets being returned to the family, it didn't really do him any good because he ended up losing the assets anyway because he was a terrible businessman. But as the years rolled on, he carried on making sort of ever more far-fetched claims. And so there were a lot of legal papers around these restitution claims, and that's how I managed to track down a lot of the family history. And I also ended up with a few artifacts as well. So I had a mixture of traveling, artifacts, photos, and papers that really helped the research job for the book. And what I think we're going to do is hopefully, if Sue's slideshow works, we're going to walk through some of the slides to walk you through a little bit of the story in the book. And hopefully this will work. So don't worry about reading the script. This is just to give you a flavour of some of the documents. This is a document that is my great-grandmother, Sophie Schindler's birth certificate. Now, for those who read German, they will see that the word Tauf, which actually means christening, has been struck out at the top there and replaced with Geburt, as in birth certificate. This was a very curious document, and throughout the document, the word Tauf has been struck out. So this is a document that's been repurposed by some civil servant somewhere. And it's a document that was produced 33 years after her actual birth. So for some official purpose, we think to buy a property. But there are two very curious things about the document, which I think are interesting. The very last two columns talk about a Beschneidungszeuge and a Beschneider. Now, that, of course, is a circumcision witness and the circumcisor Noel, which, of course, was completely inappropriate for a girl baby. But again, someone has looked at it and obviously thought, oh my goodness, this is what Jews did. They circumcised children. So again, a very underinformed official, I suspect. But for me, it was the sixth and the seventh column that really, I appreciate it's probably quite too small on the screen, so don't worry. The sixth and seventh column that are the most interesting, because they took me back 2 generations, way back into the 18th century in Bohemia, in the southern Czech Republic, and they told me that not only my great-grandmother came from a distilling family, but her father and his father before that were distillers. They made Brandwein, brandy. Next slide, please, Sue.
Hold on a moment. No, it's not. There we go.
Okay, so this is the remnants of my distilling family. On the left is the bottle of Mocha liqueur. Now, my father kept this by his bedside every day of his life. And for me, this symbolises everything he'd lost. He'd lost his distilling empire. It's got a shabby label. It's very Austro-Hungarian empire colours, gold and black and red. And it's got the Tyroler eagle on towards the bottom of the bottle with an S for Schindler on it. Also, on the same photo, you'll see a slightly more modern bottle, which quite extraordinarily, my husband and I walked into a schnapps shop a liquor shop in Innsbruck in 2019. And when I explained to a slightly bemused shopkeeper that I was, a part of a distilling family of Innsbruck, she produced this bottle off a high shelf, which must have been perhaps one of the last bottles that was produced by the Schindler distillery in 1938, because I can't imagine where else it will have come from. And someone had preserved this bottle and kept it on a shelf. You'll see that the branding for a Jewish family is not terribly great because it has SS Samuel Schindler on the eagle at the bottom. That branding was dropped rather quickly by my grandfather after the Second World War. Next slide, please, Sue.
That's a quick question. Did you and or Jeremy and anyone else try the branding note.
They're just for posterity there. So let me introduce you to my family. So this is about 1912, this photo, and you can tell that from the long dresses that the women are wearing and the winged collars that the men are wearing. My great-grandmother Sophie Schindler is on the left-hand side. She's sitting behind her husband, my great-grandfather Samuel Schindler. And then arrayed to Sophie's left are their children. Martha Schindler, who became married and became Martha Salzer. I'll come back to her. Otto, who became a doctor. My grandfather, Hugo, and right at the edge, Eric, his brother, his older brother, and then sitting down is the baby of the family, Erwin Schindler. Now, you can see they're well-to-do. They've had a formal studio shot done of them. They have money, they're happy, and they are settled. Next slide, please, Sue. Now, this is 1914, the summer of 1914. And it's a very different vibe, this photo. So this is a photo from the family album. Again, you can see Sophie Schindler sitting down, less beautifully turned out, perhaps, and Samuel Schindler sitting there, stoic in his bowler hat, and three really excited young men who are about to go off and fight for their Kaiser. So they're fighting for the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They're fighting for Kaiser Franz Joseph. And you can see what the lad on the left-hand side is doing. He's got his hand on his mother's shoulder and he's saying to her, "Mum, it's okay. I'm going to be all right. We're all going to come back. And it's going to be such fun," of which, of course, it was a promise that he could absolutely not deliver on. And you can see the anxiety etched on Sophie's face in that photo, a very different photo from the one we've just seen. Next slide, please. So this is a slide of my grandfather, Hugo. He's sitting on the right-hand side. He's up in the mountains. He's clearly on some kind of reconnaissance trip. He joined the Kaiserschützen, which was a particular regiment which was trained in Alpine warfare. He was very keen on the military, and in fact, he joined as a cadet well before the First World War. And I managed to extract from the Imperial War Museum in Vienna his cadet records, which told me, that he spoke Italian and that he was able to ride a bicycle and ride horses. Quite how useful a bicycle was going to be in that landscape, I don't know. But you can see, I love the composition of this photo. It's one of the photos I inherited, not least because the soldier standing at the back in the middle of the photo is holding a bottle of schnapps. And something makes me think that Hugo had this photo taken in order to send it back to the family business to promote schnapps. Because they're clearly having a little tot of something fortifying before they carry on their reconnaissance trip. Next slide, please. And this is my gorgeously handsome, if I say so myself, grandfather, Hugo Schindler. And he's clearly delighted with himself. He's been decorated for bravery. He has the Edelweiss on his collar from the Alpine regiment that he serves in, and he knows he's good looking. He's got that little smile playing about his lips. And I think there's something very interesting about looking at these photos because for me, they really speak to me in a way that sort of ordinary history books don't. Next slide, please. Now, this is the front on which my grandfather fought. This is the top end of Italy, so it shows northern Italy. And the line that you can see starts in Switzerland on the left-hand side and goes right the way through the mountains and down to Trieste on the Adriatic. And that was a truly murderous front. We talk about the mincing machine of the Western Front and the number of young men who died there. this was a front where you were just as likely to be swept off the mountain by an avalanche as you were to be shot by a sniper's bullet. My grandfather did survive the war. Sadly, his younger brother Erwin, the chap who was seated in the formal family shot you saw, didn't survive. Next slide, please. I talked about walking the places. It has to be said that my family have been incredibly patient with me. I have dragged them up mountains and I have taken them to all sorts of obscure landscapes. Now, this is me and my son after a 7-hour hike up Mount Krön. Now, Mount Krön is on exactly on that trajectory you just saw in the mountains. It's now neither owned by Italy nor by Austria. And in the foreground of that picture, you can see the First World War fortifications. And I think the shot gives you some sense of how incredibly difficult it was fighting up in the mountains. Mount Krön was actually held by the Italians largely through the war. That is not the position on the other mountains that you can see around you. Mostly the Austrians were on the upper slopes and the Italians were trying to fight their way up the mountain. And the fascinating thing about this front is that the Austrians, of the 12 battles of the Isonzo, as they're called, the Austrians largely won those battles. I think they won 11 of them. It didn't do them any good ultimately, obviously, because they lost, along with Germany, the First World War. But it gives you some sense of why the Austrians, and particularly the Tyrolers, felt so utterly bereft and dispossessed when the war did come to an end, because those that were fighting from the Tyrol on this front thought they had won. Next slide, please. Now, this links with my lovely American audience. So this is a cartoon of President Wilson, who is being asked by a classically Tyroler hero, Franz Hebel, what exactly he thinks. So this is just at the time that the Treaty of Versailles was being signed and Europe was being divided up. Now, Wilson, as you'll remember, sought to offer people self-determination and autonomy. And this Austrian hero is saying, Mr. Wilson, hey, Mr. Wilson, do I look like an Italian? And the purpose of the cartoon was to point out that the South Tyrol, which had been promised to the Italians in order to get them into the war by the British, so let me rephrase that, the Italians had initially not been part of the First World War. They had dilly-dallied about whether they should join it on the Austro-Hungarian German side or whether they should join it on the British side. The British side, in a piece of stunning diplomacy, a stunningly devious diplomacy, said, if you, the Italians, come in on our side and bring with you 1 million bayonets into the war, we will give you the South Tyrol. That's the landscape sort of falling away from the Brenner Pass southwards. A landscape that had belonged to the Austro-Hungarian Empire for centuries. And the Italians really liked the idea of gaining a piece of land that they had long had their eyes on. And so they joined the war on the British side. And this cartoon really sums up the real fear in the hearts of the Austrians that at the end of the war, they would lose the South Tyrol, because that was what was being proposed. And he is essentially begging Wilson to reconsider. He's saying, I'm Austrian, I'm not Italian. Please do not give the South Tyrol to the Italians. Next slide, please. So after the First World War, as we know, Austria was left as a rump state and had been deprived of its various satellite lands. And the Tyrol in particular, this is a classic Tyroler in lederhosen, in leather trousers, leather shorts. The Tyrolers were particularly bereft. So they had lost the South Tyrol, the land that they considered to be their southern cousins, the land that delivered soft fruits and grapes and wine to the North Tyrol. They lost the South Tyrol to the Italians. And a plebiscite very shortly after the First World War said, for heaven's sake, let's join up with our German cousins. Now, this is long before the right, this is long before Hitler. This is early 1920s, where the solution to the North Tyrol that sees itself as cut off and bereft is to join up with Italy. And the big building block that the Herculean Tiroler is lifting up to marry those two bridges up is labelled Anschluss. Obviously a term that echoes down through the centuries because of Hitler. But this was a thinking in the Tyrol. We can't survive on our own. We need to join with Germany. Next slide, please. So my grandfather's reaction, as we know, as I've told you, to the First World War is to come home to Innsbruck, not just carry on running the distillery that the family owned, but he decided to open this extraordinary cafe. This is an early 1920s shot of the Maria Theresienstrasse, and on the left-hand side you can just see the Café Schindler and the triple-fronted facade. Next slide, please. There you have another shot of the Café Schindler where you can see the lettering and you can see the mountains to the left of the photo. Next slide, please. And there you have an interior shot. This is the banquette I'm sitting at as I'm eating cake in the cafe. And again, you can see the street, you can see everything that's happening in this town, and you have these extraordinarily beautiful mountains, the Nordkette, that dominate the town. Next slide, please. And I talked a little bit about jazz. So this is some artwork that my grandfather commissioned for the cafe. And I like this artwork because it's a move away from Austro-Hungarian gold, red and black lettering. It's forward-looking, it's fresh, it's bright blue and cream. And there's a beautiful jazz band in the background. There's a saxophonist and there's a couple dancing and a drummer and a keyboard player. And our son has just started as a tenor saxophonist at music college, so I'm particularly keen on this photo. And I love the fact that my grandfather played jazz in the cafe, particularly as obviously jazz was banned later on. Next slide, please. So, time rolls by and we roll on to 1933. The cafe has been an extraordinary success in town, and my grandfather ran it. But in 1933, he sends out this flyer to his patrons, the people in town who are going to turn up and party for New Year. And you don't need to read, I'll read you a little bit of the writing, but it talks about 2 happy months, Sylvester and Fasching. So Sylvester is the New Year and Fasching is Carnival time, 1933. Now, I don't need to remind this incredibly erudite audience that, of course, Hitler came to power in Germany in January 1933. And my grandfather is fully aware of that. He talks about, despite the terrible times, come and party at the cafe. And he talks about, despite the difficulty, we will be providing fun for you for 2 whole months in the cafe. And you can come and dance to the band Fox, and you can come and party. He's still interested in partying, my grandfather, even though this is 1933, early 33. Next slide, please. In the meantime, this is what's happening outside the cafe. So this is a shot from the cafe down into the crowd. And I get the sense that my grandfather would have been terrified by what he was seeing in the streets below. Long before the arrival of the Nazis and long before the Anschluss, you were getting these sorts of crowds in the main street outside his cafe. And there's one particular face in the crowd, right in the middle of the photo, the only whole face that you can see, which is one Franz Hebel. Now, this man was to become the Gauleiter, the leader of the Gau, which was the Nazi demarcation of counties. he was going to become the leader of the Gau for Hitler, and he was going to lead the Tyrol and Vorarlberg, the next most westerly province. He was a man who was born in Salzburg and ended up being educated in Innsbruck. He was also the man who decided that he was going to take over not only our own villa, but he was going to ensure that the cafe was sold to one of his friends. Next slide, please. So, the Nazis have arrived. This changes everything in the Tyrol. This is a tourist snapshot, a tourist postcard, and some enterprising local photographer has decided that the way to ornament the beautiful mountains around the Tyrol is to have a swastika rising as a sun behind the Nordkette, the beautiful mountains. Next slide, please. And this is March 1938. This isn't Hitler. Hitler does come to Innsbruck. This is a senior Nazi who is arriving just after the Anschluss. The ecstatic crowds are very similar to other photos you will have seen of everywhere else in Austria, in Linz and in Vienna. But I think it's particularly poignant because it's happening straight outside the cafe. The cafe is on the right-hand side, just out of shot. And this Nazi soldier is saluting essentially his cronies who are in the cafe opposite my grandfather's cafe. Next slide, please. The beautiful mountains have now been defaced as a welcome to the Nazis with 10-foot high lettering. Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer, one people, one empire, one leader, and with a swastika to top it off. Next slide, please. So what's happened to the cafe in the meantime? It is still just about the Schindler Cafe, but in April 1938, my grandfather wakes up to find graffiti all over the outside of his cafe. Now, I can only imagine his shock because this will have been done by local people that he knew. This was a small town. And you can see in the photo just about, happy journeys to Palestine. You can see, Jew all over the outside of it. You can see the six-pointed star. You can also see the top right-hand corner just Manda Jetzt Zeit, which was the rallying cry for Hofer, who was one of the heroes, the hero that we saw talking to Wilson. And I think it must have been a very, very sad morning when my grandfather woke up to see this. Next slide, please. So this is Hofer, the man you saw in the crowded shot. He's now the Gauleiter, and he's welcoming Hitler to Innsbruck. Hitler makes a couple of visits to Innsbruck, and he's clearly sharing a joke with him. He's one of 42 Gauleiters. He reports directly to Hitler. He also took over our villa, my family's villa in Innsbruck, as it was the nicest house in town. Next slide, please. So, Hofer, the Gauleiter, ensured that the cafe was handed over to one of his cronies. Now, the fascinating thing about that is that the branding that the Schindler family had used in their cafe was difficult to beat. So this is actually a Nazi cup, and I know that because it says Café Konditorei Hebel on it. But you'll see if Sue puts up the next slide that it's exactly the same as the Schindler branding. So obviously they couldn't beat the branding between the two cafes. The interesting thing about Franz Hebel, who was the Nazi who ran the cafe for the 7 years that he was in charge of it, was that he ran the cafe. He had training in hospitality. He was good at his job, but as the Nazis were perhaps, having supply chain issues, as the British would call it nowadays. He became a black marketeer, and he used to use his logistics position in the army to bring in, chocolate and silk stockings and brandy and champagne for the cafe. Now, the Nazis were very keen on probity. They were very keen on people abiding by the rules. And he was caught as a black marketeer, and he faced trial, and he potentially faced the death penalty. He wrote to one of his friends, Himmler, who intervened into his sentencing and said, "Look, don't send this chap to the in front of a firing squad. I would like him to carry on running the cafe." And so he gets off his potentially sort of capital offence and is sent back to run the cafe, at Himmler's behest, because the cafe was the main watering hole for the Nazis, and it was so important for morale amongst the Nazis that it was important that this chap carried on running it. So a little sort of side story about the Nazi who ran the cafe. But it was essentially the cafe that saved his life. So that's an interesting aspect of it. Next slide, please. This is Martha Schindler, or Martha Salzer, as she became. She's my great aunt, and my family largely escaped to London. Some of the family then also escaped to America, where they are now. Martha, sadly, with my great-grandmother Sophie Schindler and with her husband Siegfried Salzer, became trapped in Vienna. They didn't make it out, and there are some heartrending letters between her and my family in London, describing their time in Vienna, and in particular one that I think Sue will read. Next slide, please. Last September, I had the enormous honour of putting in some Stolpersteine, some of these brass plates that many of you I think will be familiar with, for my family, the family that didn't make it out. Sophie and Siegfried and Martha were deported to Theresienstadt. Sophie was 83 at the time. She didn't survive very long in Theresienstadt. She died a few weeks after arrival, followed fairly swiftly by Martha's husband Siegfried, who also died in Theresienstadt. Martha, my great aunt, was made of sterner stuff. She survived Theresienstadt and was deported to Auschwitz, and there the trail runs cold. She was murdered there. And that was the last slide I was going to show you. I think, Sue, you were going to potentially read Martha's letter from just before she was deported.
I can do that, and I apologize for any mispronunciations. And I hope that I'm reading it because it's a difficult letter for Meriel to read, but having read it and also having read the book and feel connected, hopefully I'll get through it as well. My darling relation, is that how you pronounce? Okay. Unexpectedly today, we received the order for departure tomorrow morning, although it had been intended only for the coming month. Imagine what that means, and in view of Mamela's Sophie's deplorable state of health. But I prefer to take her along rather than abandon her here. And my very dear, cherished, generous mother prefers to be together with us, even though she fears the journey. I am writing this in bed. What will our next resting place be? But supposedly Theresienstadt, where we are going, is relatively bearable, and supposedly people are allowed to go about freely in the town. I would have liked to record the recent past in this journal, although all feelings have been dismal. I know you have thought about us with anxiety and sadness, but no sign of your love has reached us. Like a miner buried alive, I have been sending out signals. Were they not heard, not understood, unanswered? I am sending you old journal notes. I place them in your hands, my dearest Lily. since they are not intended for my children. After all, they illuminate only a very brief portion of my life, plunging me into the deepest of grief as a result of the loss of my father and brother, and tell nothing about the happiness I received from the children in their tender youth, my best years of life, the memory of which continues to resound in me. These events occurred before that time when their development and unique characteristics, their gifts of intellect and heart moved me and filled me with pride. My darling Lily, I must close. An immeasurably difficult day is ahead of me. It will call for strength and composure and a great deal of work, with which I must begin in the early dawn if I want to manage it at all. I have not yet given up all hope to be able to survive this difficult time. But if that which will be inflicted on us on the coming day should prove to be unbearable, I have the means to bring about a painless end. When you see how cruel a natural end can be, and mostly is, the freely chosen one does not frighten. But it must be really physically unbearable before I would choose to make use of this means. So stay well, my dearest beloved Lilychen. Be happy in the midst of your loved ones, to whom I send my most heartfelt greetings, especially Trudinder. Embracing you full of faithful love, I remain your Martha.
So that letter was written the night before they left for Theresienstadt and is the last written record of her before she then ends up in Theresienstadt and then a couple of years later in Auschwitz. And I think it's a particularly poignant and beautiful letter for many reasons. So thank you very much for reading it, Sue. So I suspect we have questions and comments and all sorts of exciting things.
So one of the questions is, and you referred to this at the beginning, you spoke a little bit about the difficult and challenging relationship with your father. He did not live to see this book written. What do you think your father would make of this book?
Yes. So let me go back. So he, as I said, he told a lot of fibs and was a fantasist. I think he would have loved the fact that his name was on a book, the front of a book. But the moment he read the contents, which dissect the various anecdotes he told us, I think he probably would have just reached for a lawyer to sue me, to be honest. So.
And when you reflect on, well, you spent a lot of time in Austria doing this research and talking about different aspects of the story. What do Austrians make of the book? Have you heard from those in the community there? Do you have relationships that you've maintained?
Yes, I mean, I don't have any relations in Austria anymore, but I mean, Austria was a strange place when I was there. I was there in the sort of early 80s at school, and at that point, I would never have dreamt of asking anyone what their father or grandfather did in the Second World War. It just was a complete taboo subject. Austria depicted itself after the war as Hitler's first victim. And of course, that is utterly contradicted by the cheering crowds on Hitler's arrival in Austria. But I think what is now the reception for this sort of book is rather different than it was, say, even 10, 15 years ago. The newer historians have reshaped the history and Austria's understanding of itself. And Austria is doing much more than it has ever done before to take responsibility for what happened. And I think Germany got there a lot quicker. Austria was in denial until about 15 years ago, but I think that is gently improving. And the book will come out in German, in Austria and Germany next spring. And I fully intend to do some level of promotion there. And I think people will be interested because it's a very Austrian tale. It's a tale that it's difficult to dislike it because it's about cake, but it's also it's an interesting tale because it's a tale, as I said, of provincial Austria, and it's the part of Austria that had so few Jews, so it has a very different origin for the anti-Semitism that it suffered from.
Along those lines, you talked about, there being so few Jews, and your family was in many ways very assimilated. In fact, there were family members who did convert to Catholicism. Tell all of us, if you'll share a little bit about your own Jewish journey and how you feel about your Jewish heritage now.
It's a lovely question. I mean, I was brought up not at all within the faith, in that my father's mantra to us was, do not tell anyone you are Jewish. So I was brought up in an entirely secular home. I then went and married a Jewish man, much, I think, to my father's surprise. And so I'm immensely proud of my Jewish heritage. It means enormous amount to me. We participate in high holy days and festivals through his family. So I'm very proud of my heritage now. And I think, I said that I was often very angry with my father. I think the process of writing the book has allowed me to be at peace with what he was and who he was. And I think also just to appreciate the very rich story that I inherited.
So a question that just came into the chat, are there any family members, cousins who were rabbis or cantors?
No. I think it was, I think my grandfather he was first and foremost a Tyroler. He loved the mountains, he liked walking in the mountains. And, then he was an Austrian, a citizen of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and probably his third identity was being Jewish. So I think it was he was a man of his country, I think.
Sí.
No, pone.
Escribimos.
Ahí ya está. ¿Dejas?
The last at the end of your book, you have and the last picture you showed us certainly speaks to this topic, but I believe it's the last chapter, is memory and memorials. And your book is certainly a combination of both. It is both filled with memories, not all your own, but certainly yours woven in. And also it is a memorial to your family, which is beautiful. Would you share a little bit about that aspect of this journey of writing this book, and sort of, as you look ahead, what you think, how you think that might continue to play a role?
So you used a beautiful phrase, which is a keeper of memory, and I think that the hard covers of this book are about keeping memory. And I think one of the things that is very important about the Holocaust story and the second generation, particularly who tell that story for the third generation, is that you have to find a way of transmitting that story in a way that's different or new. And I think telling the story of Western Austria, where there were so few Jews, I think is very interesting, because I think it points to a need for vigilance, a need to understand that anti-Semitism can arise in all sorts of circumstances. It's not just where there is, economic crisis. It's not just about that. It arises in, it's one of the things that Hannah Arendt talks about it as a fungus. It's rootless, it grows in the dark. And we need to be vigilant about anti-Semitism and call it out when we come across it. The story of anti-Semitism in Western Austria is one, I think, that is born out of the fact that land is constricted, it's overshadowed by mountains. There is a fear of outsiders as a result of the geographic landscape. It was also conservative, Catholic, agrarian, and not particularly educated. Those are the particular circumstances in Western Tyrol. The anti-Semitism was just as vicious as in the East, as in Vienna, but it's a different flavour of anti-Semitism, if you like, because, and perhaps I mean, perhaps sadder in some ways, because the people who beat up my grandfather on Kristallnacht were people who were known to him. This wasn't anonymous daubing of the cafe. This is people who were known to Hugo, my grandfather.
You share towards the beginning of the book the story of Philip Halsman becomes Philippe. Really, that story of the anti-Semitism that was there, perhaps under the surface, and the opportunity for those anti-Semites in the community to bring it into the light. But it must have been there and festering.
Yes,
and certainly. There are a few more questions coming. One is, was there a Wienerwald when you were there? Am I pronouncing it correctly?
A Wienerwald. So the Wienerwald is an area sort of in eastern Austria near Vienna. Is it a Wald or Walz? Sorry, maybe I'll have a look at the question.
It's that one's in the chat to everyone, so you should be able to see it. And they said it was 1971 when we were there. I guess it was the building of the cafe.
Yes. So 71, the cafe, you're absolutely right, the person who posted that. So the name of the cafe, I'll tell you a little bit about the trajectory of the cafe. So the cafe, as I said, was restituted. My grandfather returned. He was one of the very, very few Jews who returned to the Tyrol. It came back into his hands after the war. But he only lived until 1952, and he died sadly of a heart attack. The cafe then passed to my father and his cousin. My father managed to fall out with his cousin immediately, and they eventually sold the cafe. The branding, I talked about branding a little bit, the branding was so good that the cafe name stayed into the 70s, I think, and then it disappeared. And when I lived in Austria in the 80s, there was no Café Schindler at all. And the extraordinary story arc of this story is that when we were on a family holiday in Austria, we were walking down the Maria-Theresienstraße, the street that you've just seen in the 1920s and 30s photos. And I'm regaling my kids with your great grandfather had a cafe here and it was called Café Schindler, and the importance of coffee and cake and all that stuff. And we look up and we suddenly realise that in the exact same building, the cafe name is back. It's called Das Schindler, so the Schindler, Schindler's place, if you like. But the cafe is back. So I then sort of immediately cross the road and storm up to the first floor and demand to speak to the owner. My children are obviously deeply embarrassed by this and thinking, oh my God, she's going to make a scene. The owner isn't there, and then I enter into a sort of email dialogue with him. I think he's a little bit cautious, as I have a lawyer sign off on my email. But we meet the following year, and he explains that he was a restaurateur from Salzburg. He fell in love with a local girl in Innsbruck, wanted to open a cafe. And no matter where he turned, the planning office, his future brother-in-law, everyone in Innsbruck said, my friend, you have to call it Café Schindler. And he was like, who on earth are these people? Anyway, he went to the local archives, typed in the Schindler name, and suddenly saw many of the photos that you've just seen, and realised he had a ready-made heritage, if you like. And so he called it Schindler. And so next year, I am incredibly proud of the fact that the cafe will celebrate its centenary. And it is the only previously owned Jewish business that is still in operation. Okay, it's not owned by Jews anymore, but the name is still there. And I think that is a testament to the resilience of people, of the Jewish people in the area. We have one business there that is still named after the family, and that, for me, was really important.
It's very special. Another listener asked if you know, and I believe you did touch on this in the book, but do you know if your family is related to Oskar Schindler?
So this,
I'd say that you were
at the beginning. So. Yes, we have the same name, but my father said we were, but I don't think we were. So I spent a lot of time trying to work these things out. So the answer to the things that I posed at the beginning were Kafka, very, very distantly related, but so distant you really, really wouldn't brag about it like my father did. Oskar Schindler, I don't think so. Bruno Kreisky, again, very distantly related. Again, you wouldn't brag about it, it's so distant. Alma Schindler, definitely not, definitely different family. She became Alma Mahler, as you probably know. And the thing about Kristallnacht, so the central story to my father's very troubled life, so he always explained the fact that he was, he was in trouble, he was being pursued by creditors, and he was eventually went to jail for fraud. This was all told in terms of his traumatic childhood as a child of the war, and that he told a lot of people, including his children, that he was there on Kristallnacht when his father was beaten up by Nazi thugs. This is not a spoiler, because I think this is sort of fairly obvious from the book, this was a central untruth. This was not true. My father came to England in September 1938. He was not there on Kristallnacht. So this is also about a more nuanced story of Jews who don't always tell the truth about what was going on in the war. Yes, he had a terrible time and he had to flee, but he was safely in London. He wasn't there on Kristallnacht.
Thank you. So going back to something we touched on at the beginning and demonstrated and showed, another question about why the English and American covers are different. And if you care to comment on, I know what your opinion is on the covers, but it'll be interesting to share and see what people think.
Hopefully you can see this, that the English cover is a sort of blue wash of the cafe, but with the graffiti. So it's a very pretty picture, despite the fact it's got Nazi graffiti in the background. The American publishers, however, determined in their wisdom that it needed to be red, black and white, and it definitely needed a picture of Hitler on the front. And it's interesting, it's a very different take on, I suppose, on publishing. My English publishers took a different route, and my American publishers said, no, that photo is far too subtle, the English one. We need a red, black and white one with Hitler on the front. So that's what they did. And I'm afraid any of you who have ever signed an author contract will know that your publisher has final say on the cover.
And it does make for an interesting conversation in thinking about perhaps what appeals, if it is in the commercial aspect, in the advertising and publicity. But really what we all know is that you can't judge a book by its cover alone. Although it gives you, depending on which one you look at, gives you a different perspective as you begin this book. But really such a captivating story, and in all of the unique aspects that Meriel shared, just not only in the geography, but in the telling of this family story over the generations. And it was so helpful. There is a family tree at the front, which I consulted repeatedly just to make sure was able to keep everyone straight. And what is so wonderful is to know, Meriel, that you have made these connections with family members, and your family has grown exponentially as a result, that you've been able to make these connections and heal some of those past wounds and rifts, and rebuild and start new relationships that I know will be lasting for your children and generations to come. Yeah.
No, it's been a curative and healing process, the writing. One of the anecdotes my father also told, which was, I think, a very odd anecdote, which was that his Jewish uncle had actually treated Hitler as a child, as an adolescent man, as a 17-year-old, and indeed treated Hitler's mother, Clara. Now, I always discounted this story, and it was actually one of the stories that he told that was true. So I had to rather eat my words when I discovered it was actually true. So there's a whole subplot in the story about the good Dr. Bloch, who was essentially my great uncle, my father's uncle, who was in fact a Jewish GP who treated Hitler and Hitler's mother, and who survived the war entirely unscathed. And the other US connection to this is that he fled to New York very late. He was entirely protected by Hitler. He fled and lived in New York and died in the late 1940s. And his memoir is in the Washington Holocaust Museum.
Thank you. And that is an amazing piece of the story as well. And certainly, you know, I heard of, you know, there's a reference that Hitler famously made, that if every Jew was like his Dr. Bloch, there would be no problem with the Jews.
Yeah, but I mean, apparently this wasn't that unusual. A lot of the Nazis had their kind of pet Jew that they protected or liked. It was just the rest of them they didn't wanted to exterminate. But it's very discombobulating as a story, because you don't quite know what to make of it. And actually, I always discounted it as a story, but in fact, it's actually true. So part of the unpicking of my history was me to find that out.
So last question is, now that you have written this story, is there another book in there? Do you think, or do you have something else that's formulated?
I loved the process of researching and writing this story. I absolutely loved it. And I'm having huge fun talking to people about it. I think in order to have the right motivation to write another book, you have to be clear about what you're saying and why you're saying it. So I'm mulling over a few ideas, and you know, I've got some ideas, but I don't know whether they'll come to fruition. I think it takes a long time to write a book. You need to have complete sort of devotion to the task. So I'm not entirely sure, but I have certainly got some ideas. Thank you.
Well, we certainly hope you'll keep us posted, and
yeah,
we look forward to that opportunity. We also hope that at some point in the future that we'll have an opportunity to meet you in person, to welcome you to Washington.
I would love to. I have one of my cousins, my newly discovered cousins, lives in Washington. So, and in fact, when I came over in 2018, I visited Washington to meet some of my relatives there. So,
well, we will certainly look forward to welcoming you. If and when that happens, please keep me posted, and we can think about a chance to get together. But we thank you so much, Meriel, for your time today, and really for this beautiful book as well, and really mesmerizing, captivating. And I encourage everyone, again, I know the link is in the chat. We encourage you to sit down with a cup of coffee, and again, the recipes are in the back. I do know what I'll be doing in some of my spare time will be attempting to replicate, and really what a treat to be with you today. We thank you very much. We are again, we thank the Jewish Book Council for bringing you to us, and are delighted that you've been part of our Amram Scholar Series this year.
Thank you very, very much. It's been an absolute pleasure.